I see. Very intriguing. What a classic. Oh, hi there. Didn't see you coming. Welcome to something slightly different from the usual. Basically, this year I've been trying to include a small animation at the start of each video to make them a bit more entertaining. However, I've quickly run into a small problem with this format, namely that animation takes way too long to make. So I thought that perhaps I could make a more casual review-style video to fill in the gaps. Just to clarify, this format isn't replacing the regular style. Simply think of these as intermissions, I guess. I will still throw in a drawing or two as usual though, since those don't take as much time to draw. At any rate, let's dive into today's title, Hanachirutani Sanjinkou, written by the one and only Mareni. Some of you might be wondering why I picked such a quote-unquote major untranslated Kamige VN for this style of video, instead of giving it the full review treatment. There are two reasons for that. One, the game is filled with non-YouTube friendly imagery and themes, so I didn't want to risk spending an entire month drawing, animating, and editing something that might get immediately demonetized. And two, I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about it, but let's not beat around the bush any longer and dive right into the game. Set in the time between the two great wars, the story of Hanachirutani Sanjinkou is one of revenge. Inami Toya was living a peaceful life with his foster father and the foster father's daughter, with whom he was happily engaged. However, one nefarious night, as she was walking alone through the streets, she was ambushed and brutally murdered by a mysterious beast. After hearing the events, Inami swears to enact revenge not only upon the perpetrator, but all the mountain creatures. I guess I should mention that these mountain creatures refer to certain mystical beings, and not the regular animals living there. Although it would be pretty funny having him stomping on every bug and critter he sees. Anyway, one day during his travels, he comes across an altercation in the streets of the town where he is lodging. A young girl is being pestered by three rough, scruffy men. Cutting through the curious onlookers, Inami jumps in and scares off the scoundrels. Not so much out of goodwill as out of annoyance at the commotion. That same night, however, the girl he had just rescued sneaks into his room and tries to steal his gun. Inami catches her red-handed, and after getting a good look at her, he notices that, much to his unpleasant surprise, she is the spitting image of his deceased beloved. To him, this resemblance is akin to an act of profanity, a mockery of the only person he truly loved. Blinded by fury, he raises his fist and invites her to spend the night playing a very fun session of Super Smash Bros. While chugging copious amounts of delicious grape juice. After having such a great time, he gifts her a very nice collar-shaped necklace as a sign of friendship, and thus the two embark on a wholesome adventure, defeating the baddies and playing lots and lots of consensual Super Smash Bros. If you can read through the YouTube-friendly lines, you can probably infer why this game can be so divisive. The protagonist is truly one piece of work. If I were to describe him in a few words, I guess you could say he's kind of like Rance, if you took away his carefree attitude and charisma, and then exchanged it for raw, unadulterated hatred. Having to endure him throughout the narrative can be outright agonizing, and it's definitely not one of those cases where he grows on you, because while his anger might be justified, his actions are most definitely not. Admittedly, the narrative doesn't try to pass him off as some sort of misunderstood martyr, but that doesn't change the fact that he is simply an unpleasant human being. I should clarify that I'm not entirely against the idea of unconventional protagonists. In fact, Sakuya from Albatross Koukairoku, another Mareni-written VN, was also quite unlikable, but despite that, he still left a positive impression on me. That's mainly due to the hierarchy and dynamics between the cast members. In other words, he was meant to be pathetic, but it worked because he was below nearly everyone else in terms of authority. However, in Hanachirutani, that hierarchy feels completely reversed, almost as if there's no one who can put a stop to his madness, with one exception that I'll get to in a moment. I think the biggest issue is that even the characters who are supposed to be his equals come across as if they have to prostrate themselves before him, which makes it seem like he can get away with almost anything. I can understand that the game aims to focus on an internal struggle rather than an external one, but seeing him constantly get away without consequences can at times be jarring. However, among the cast members, there's the one sole shining exception. That one being Rindou, which first of all, put some goddamn clothes on, lady. How am I supposed to make a family-friendly video with Monster Mommy flaunting her cowabungas all over the screen? Please stop doing that. Anyway, she's one of the mountain creatures, and a powerful one at that, often referred to as the Princess of the Mountain. As such, she too is one of Inami's targets. But unlike the others, she definitely gives off final boss vibes. Or at least she does at first. There's quite a lot more to this character than meets the eye. I really enjoyed the playfulness and charm in how she interacts with Inami, as it gave the plot a much-needed breath of fresh air in what was an otherwise almost asphyxiating atmosphere. Huge props to the voice actress as well. I already liked her role as the stowaway in Albatross, but she was the perfect casting choice for Rindou. I wonder what she has been up to lately. Regardless, it's kind of a shame that she only appears during the second half of the game, since she ended up being one of the most interesting characters alongside Ichi, Inami's slave. I mean, Inam's super-duper friend. Yup, nothing to see here. Speaking of Ichi, I think her relationship with Inami was one of the game's highlights. It's probably the most toxic relationship I've seen in a VN, but romance in Mareni titles is often fairly idiosyncratic. Her character arc was surprisingly convincing despite the circumstances she found herself in. The Prose, as expected from Mareni, does a great job of depicting her inner struggles and how her state of mind slowly becomes more and more warped. It's all shown in a very crude manner, never embellishing or romanticizing a single detail. This bleakness is what defines the atmosphere of Hanachirutani, most clearly evidenced by how death is narratively portrayed. You see, in most stories about revenge, there's a certain element of retribution in how violence is presented. After all, those premises are rooted in the idea that the protagonist seeks justice by their own means. However, that same premise has a fundamental contradiction, and I'm not only talking about how sometimes the protagonist hypocritically spares the villain's life at the last second, despite having no issue slaying all of their lackeys. I'm talking about how violence and the very act of revenge itself is meant to be something enjoyable and entertaining as a spectator. Hanachirutani, on the other hand, is ruthlessly brutal about its thematical cynicism. There's not a single action scene where a lawful force faces an evil entity, and the resolutions of those conflicts are hauntingly depressing. Every death scene is just breathtaking in its sheer emotional impact. They leave no joy, no gratification, nor any vindication, only a devastatingly lethargic sense of sorrow. They are to me the absolute peak of this game, in no small part thanks to the impeccable writing, which I guess I should stop dancing around the topic and discuss it. I usually don't bring up topics such as quality of the prose or Japanese difficulty, but for Mareni, I kinda need to make an exception. After all, JPDB ranks this one as the hardest visual novel ever. Funnily enough, I thought the first chapter wasn't as intense as his previous works, but everything after that was the Mareni we all know and love. I have the tinfoil hat conspiracy theory that he intentionally made the first chapter easier to trick people who played the trial version into thinking the rest of it was going to be as approachable. It isn't. Still, Mareni is the type of author that once you get used to his style, it's not as impenetrable as it might originally seem. Most people will say that the main difficulty comes from the number of obscure words he uses. And while I partially agree, especially if you need to do so many lookups that it hinders on your comprehension flow, I feel like that aspect is not as big of a deal. If anything, I find it pretty fun. It's kind of like going on a kanji safari, filled with words you will probably never see again. What is an actual challenge is the act of parsing the extremely long sentences he can weave. The two main skills, so to speak, for overcoming this are your ability to retain information and your ability to understand where each clause is leading. The former is fairly self-explanatory. You will find sentences where there's a gap between two elements, which can be disorienting. Imagine if you are reading something and there's a parenthetical clause in between that's almost as long as the entire sentence. My advice is to pay attention to the commas, which might seem obvious, but I think most people overlook their grammatical structural function, and also to identify the main elements of a sentence and parse it around them. As for the latter, you basically need to discern what role each clause within a sentence has as soon as you can. In other words, you should identify whether it is a conjecture, a statement, a metaphor, indirect speech, a noun modification, and so forth. In Japanese, there are certain words and arranged sentence structures that, if you can recognize them, will help. But in the end, it's just something you eventually have to get used to. And that's basically what it boils down to. Getting used to his style. I'm aware it's quite the challenge, but once it clicks, it feels amazing to read. I honestly have all the 4 major Railsoft games installed simply because I enjoy revisiting them from time to time, just to read a couple of random scenes. Having such long sentences essentially gives the prose a lot more range in its rhythm. Shorter sentences are shorter for a reason, and longer sentences will be longer for a reason. Everything feels purposeful, not to mention how sentences seamlessly shift their perspective in a way that simply wouldn't work in another language. Or at the very least, not in the same way Mareni intended. Let me show an example.
それでも走り出したつもりになっているのは一自身だけ評価から見れば何とも頼り投げまさに夢中を踏むかの足取りでフラフラフラ危ないと声をかける先に木の根に足を取られて花面から地面にのめった始末だ
I want you to note how in my probably not so great translation, I essentially had to split the line into multiple sentences, whereas in the original it's just one single flowing string. I'm sure a more skilled translator would be able to output something far better, but I highly doubt one can replicate the original intent in a different language other than Japanese. And there are countless lines like this one. In fact, I would recommend booting up the trial version and just reading the first 5 or so pages, since I think it's a great sample of how Mareni organically and effortlessly directs the reader's point of view through descriptions that range from sweeping scope to minute details. And for all of you who criticize this style, complaining about purple prose and whatnot, I have a 2-word message for you. Skill issue. At any rate, moving on to the presentation, I don't particularly want to dwell too long on it, so I'll keep this short. I think the CGs and overall art style are great, though oddly enough, if you take a look at the opening movie or the game's promotional material, you'll see that the game has a ton unused or discarded CGs. The number of actual CGs in the game is perfectly adequate. It's just kind of odd that they threw away so much material. Something that there could have been a handful more, however, are backgrounds, especially for the mountain scenes. At times, it kind of gives the feeling that you're going around the same places over and over. That said, my biggest gripe with the game had to be the music. Okay, so the OST has around 16 tracks, which, outside of a couple of exceptions, I think are fairly good. But then, there's one track in particular that I think is just awful. Now I want you to take a good guess which track you think the game repeats all the freaking time. Needless to say, I played a good chunk of it with the music muted. To conclude, Hanachirutani Sanjinkou is a miserable experience, and I mean that in its most literal way. This is a story about misery and suffering. The protagonist and his irredeemable actions make his journey tough to empathize with. Yet those moments when the themes of the narrative shine through are gut-wrenchingly impactful. It is honestly a title extremely hard to evaluate since, whereas some visual novels suffer from having a lackluster execution of a solid premise, this one essentially executes an unappealing premise nearly flawlessly. It's by no means a fun read, quite the opposite. But at the same time, it's a work that more than earns its raison d'etre. I'm going to give it a 7.5 out of 10, but I feel this is the type of VN that you either love or hate. In fact, if this wasn't written by Mareni, I would most certainly be leaning into the latter group. As such, I don't think I can straightforwardly recommend it unless you enjoy intensely somber stories, and on top of that, you're fine with absurdly complex Japanese. Still, I think reading a Mareni VN is kind of like a rite of passage for any self-respecting JOP, although this is probably not the one I would personally tackle first. Actually, the other day I tried out a little bit of Dungeons and Daimiwaku. I say tried out, but I only read like a handful of lines. But I think it might be a good entry point to his style. I can't attest to the game's actual quality, but it definitely feels like a Mareni VN without being as overwhelming as the Railsoft titles can be. Whatever the case, let me know what you think of this format. I'm aware it's basically the same as the reviews, just with a little bit less editing effort put into them. But as I mentioned, it might be a way to increase the number of videos I upload for you. I'm still not sure how to label these though. I thought about calling it a mini review, but I ended up writing as much as I usually do. Whoopsies. At any rate, I'm just going to end the video here. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time. Mareni out.